Good evening. How's everybody doing? It's great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. Let's see who's in the house. Hold on a second. Here we go. Computer's being just slightly sluggish. No problem. We got it. Very good. Okay. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina. Bella in Florida. Paul in the Great Northwest. Shandor in the Bronx. Lucy in Minnesota. Bill in mid-Missouri. So excited for tonight's DAF. Been waiting for it since March of 2020 when I first joined. And I would say in many respects, me too. I love this story. I've learned it many times, taught it a bunch of times, and I always learn something profound from it. Most recently, when I visited my son in yeshiva in January, and I just attended as his classmate for the whole sort of parents' week. It was supposed to be just a parents' couple days, but I was able to attend for a week. And it was wonderful. And his teacher, Rav Moshe, brought beautiful, beautiful insights on this story. And I look forward to bringing some of those down for you today. Belle in Texas, Nancy in North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Karen in Northern California. I'm going to mess up this name. Alunanat. And I'm sorry that I can't read that text. Is it Ethiopian, perhaps? I'm just not sure. But welcome. Tom in Pennsylvania. Clarice in Mexico City, Ciudad de Mexico. Welcome. Maria in Texas. It is Ethiopia. Thank you so much for letting me know. Chaim in Florida. Aoife's in the house as well. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Let's get to it. We got a lot of ground to cover, so let's just get right into it. Our DAF today is page 59, Nun Tes, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're actually going to pick this up about halfway down on the short page before page 58b. With Mishna number 8 here in chapter 4. We're going to start with Mishna 8 in chapter 4, and the oven of achnai story flows from this Mishnah. So, just as there is a prohibition against exploitation, oina, in buying and selling, right, as we saw, a Jew can't charge another Jew more than a sixth over the market value of an item, with certain exceptions, and that would be called exploitation. It violates a written law in the Torah. So too, there is oina in statements. And this is understood to be, this is also called verbal mistreatment. Exploitation through words, or a different translation, verbal mistreatment, right? You can't harass somebody verbally. You can't humiliate them. You can't insult them. As we'll see, you can't apply nicknames to them that they don't appreciate. This is absolutely prohibited. You can really hurt a person with your words. Sticks and stones will break my bones, well, names will never hurt me. False. People can certainly be hurt through verbal mistreatment and name calling. That kind of humiliation and trauma can do lasting damage and is absolutely prohibited. So the Mishnah now proceeds to cite examples of verbal mistreatment. So, for example, one may not say to a seller, "For how much are you selling this item?" if he does not actually wish to purchase it. Why? Because he thereby upsets the seller when the deal fails to materialize. This is very interesting. And the notes sort of give two reasons why this might be. That if you go up to a seller in a marketplace and you pick up an item and peruse it, and ask how much it is. Now, if you never intended to buy it, if you're really just killing time, or these days in modern times, very much, this becomes a thing that if you went into a store and you wanted to get the benefit of a salesman's expertise, or just to see an item in person, and you asked him how much it costs, well, all the while you were intending to go online and buy it for a cheaper price. So this can violate this prohibition on verbal damage, verbal mistreatment. Why? Because especially if this salesman is working on commission, or if he is the owner of the store. So you pick it up, you never intended to buy it, but you act as if you do, and then somebody is watching this. So they might then misunderstand what happened for different reasons. One reason might be they see you pick it up and you're interested in it, so they think to themselves, "Oh, I would have bought that, but this guy got there first, so I guess I won't have that opportunity," and walk away, when in fact you never meant to purchase it, and that hurts the seller. Or it might be that he saw you pick it up, look at it, and then put it down and reject it, and he might have thought to buy it himself, but now that he sees, it's not valuable in the eyes of someone else who picked it up and rejected it, so he is going to sort of be ill-disposed. He will not be disposed to buy it, and that can end up having negative repercussions on the store owner. Let's keep going. Other examples in the Mishnah. If one is a penitent, so it's translated as a penitent here, but the Hebrew is a Baal Teshuva, right? So a Baal Teshuva, that's the phrase. It's a little overstates the case. What Baal Teshuva means is a master of atonement, but it really means one given to atonement. And what the phrase is used for is one who returns to a life of Torah mitzvah, a Jew who has been non-observant, right? Not a religious Jew, a secular Jew, who realizes that he's obligated in Torah and mitzvahs, and takes upon himself to live a life consistent with Torah and the Torah commandments, and to come closer to God that way. This person is called a Baal Teshuva. So if one is a Baal Teshuva, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds, right? When you were a sinner, when you were transgressing Torah regularly. You can't say that to a Baal Teshuva that he used to be secular. He might say that to you, when I was secular, I used to do such and such, but you don't say to him, well, when you were secular, you used to do such and such. And if one is the child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deeds of your ancestors. As it is stated, Exodus 22:20, and a convert, you shall neither mistreat, nor shall you oppress him. Right? And this includes just with your words reminding him that he was once not a Jew, or reminding the Baal Teshuva that he was once not an observant Jew. You cannot do that. That is prohibited. That's Mishnah number 8. Now the Gemara. The sages taught, it is written, and you shall not mistreat, tonu, one man his colleague, and you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. That's Leviticus 25:17. And the Tana explains the verse is speaking with regard to verbal mistreatment. And the Bryce explains, do you say that it is speaking of verbal mistreatment, be'oinas devarim, or perhaps it is speaking only with regard to monetary exploitation, what we were talking about the last few days? When it says in the previous verse, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquire from your colleague's hand, you shall not exploit, Toinu, his brother. That's Leviticus 25:14. So in that verse, monetary exploitation was explicitly stated. How then do I realize the meaning of the verse, you shall not mistreat one man his colleague? This must necessarily refer to verbal mistreatment, right? That you're exploiting someone not in order to make a buck, but to somehow aggrandize yourself over him, to somehow demean him, to make him feel bad. This is prohibited. You cannot use words that way. How so? If one is a Baal Tshuva, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds. If one is the child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deeds of your ancestors. If one is a convert and he came to study Torah, one may not say to him, does the mouth that ate unslaughtered carcasses and animals that had wounds that would have caused them to die within 12 months, trephos, meaning non-kosher food, does the mouth that once ate non-kosher food now come and who that once ate repugnant creatures and creeping animals, now this mouth comes to study Torah that was stated from the mouth of the Almighty? Absolutely prohibited to say such a thing to somebody who's trying to improve himself and to learn Torah and live a life of mitzvahs. You would never remind him that there was once a time when he didn't do that. Now, if torments, this is another kind of verbal mistreatment that is prohibited. If a person is being afflicted by torments, if illnesses are afflicting him, or if he is, God forbid, burying his children, one may not speak to him in the manner that the friends of Job spoke to him. When Job's friends said to him, is not your fear of God, your confidence, and your hope the integrity of your ways? Remember, I beseech you, whoever perished being innocent, meaning, this is a little bit, difficult syntax, but meaning if you're suffering, it must be that you sinned at some point, and that's why you're suffering now. 100% prohibited to tell a person in the midst of his affliction, God forbid, burying a child, or just very ill, or suffering from illness, or having financial troubles. What you do is you comfort such a person, you sit with them, you see how you can help, or you just be with them. But you don't try to rationalize and come up, and offer your theology of why they're suffering these troubles now. You don't do that. Likewise, if donkey drivers are asking to purchase grain from someone and he has none, so he may not say to them, oh, go to so-and-so, he sells grain, right? In other words, the salesman comes to you and is bothering you, and just to get rid of the salesman, you say, oh, why don't you go to so-and-so? He always buys this kind of stuff, right? You don't do that. Your purpose was just to get rid of the salesman without embarrassing yourself by having to say, you know what, I don't want to purchase, or I can't afford to purchase. So instead, you turf him off on someone else. You don't do that. Why? Because now the salesman has to travel to that person, and that person is going to be embarrassed, right? Or in this case, as it's explained right here, more specifically, you don't say to these donkey drivers who are looking to purchase grain from someone and this person has none, he may not say to the donkey driver, go to so-and-so as he sells grain, if he knows about him that he never sold grain at all. I mean, if that person maybe is a good candidate, that would be different. But if you know that the person you're sending him to isn't going to buy or sell what this guy needs, then you're turfing him for your own benefit, and it's going to hurt both the donkey driver and who you're sending him to, right? He thereby causes the donkey drivers and the would-be seller anguish. So Rabbi Yehuda says one may not even cast his eyes on the merchandise for sale, creating the impression that he is interested at a time when he does not have money to purchase it. Now you can go into a store and say, I'm not a today buyer, I'm just browsing. Now, I want you to know that. And then if the salesman or the owner wants to engage with you and sort of offer his time and friendship, and assist you, even though he knows you're not buying, that might be different. But to act like a potential buyer when you know you're not, that might well be prohibited. Verbal mistreatment is thus not typically obvious. Right? There's a lot, you may think that, it just means berating a person, humiliating them in front of others, like an awful boss who just yells at people in front of the other employees. That is verbal mistreatment, but there's many other kinds of verbal mistreatment. There's a lot of nuance and subtlety to this prohibition. So verbal mistreatment is not typically obvious, and it is difficult to ascertain the intent of the offender, as the matter is given to the heart of each individual, as only he knows what his intention was when he spoke, like one who is talking to a salesman without any intention to buy. And with regard to any matter given to the heart, it is stated, and you shall fear your God, as God is privy to the intent of the heart. Right? Certain laws the Torah adds, and you shall fear the Lord your God, because only you and God are going to know what your intent was in that moment. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, greater is the transgression of verbal mistreatment than the transgression of monetary exploitation. As with regard to this, verbal mistreatment, it is stated, and you shall fear your God. But with regard to that, monetary exploitation, it is not stated, and you shall fear your God. And Rabbi Eliezer said this explanation, that this verbal mistreatment affects one's body, but that monetary exploitation only affects one's money. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says that this monetary exploitation is given to restitution. You can make it right. But that verbal mistreatment is not given to restitution, right? If you, through gossip, for example, ruin a person's reputation, you can't make that right? You can make a public apology, but the stain on that person's reputation can never be fixed. And that's why the prohibition on gossip and on verbal mistreatment is such a stern prohibition. And the Gemara relates that the Tana who recited Mishnayos and Baraisas in the study hall taught a Baraisa before Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, saying, anyone who humiliates another person in public, it is as though he were spilling blood. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to him, you have spoken well, as we see that after the humiliated person blushes, the red leaves his face, and pallor comes into its place, which is tantamount to spilling blood. And Abaye said to Rav Dimi in the West, meaning in the land of Israel, as opposed to the Jewish community in Babylonia, Bava, in Eretz Yisrael, with regard to what mitzvah are they particularly vigilant? And Rav Dimi said to him, they are vigilant in refraining from humiliating others. As Rabbi Hanina says, everyone descends to gehinna except for 3. And this was a little bit misstated, and so the Gemara immediately says, does it enter your mind that everyone descends to gehinna? Rather say, anyone who descends to gehinna ultimately ascends, except for 3 who descend and do not ascend, right? So gehinna is basically like hell, right? It's a terrible place where your soul goes to get rectified and purified, but it's a temporary place, right? So when the soul leaves this world, all the sins that you were not able to balance out through your mitzvahs and atonement, and all the different ways in which we can purify ourselves from sin and rectify sins and make atonement for sins, the remaining sins that we carry with us, we go and spend a little time in Gehenna, and there we are purified. And then, though we descended into Gehenna, we ascend from there and go on with our journey into the world of souls. But now we're going to learn that there are 3 types of transgression for which a person, if he doesn't atone for it, will descend into gehinna and not ascend out of there, will not reemerge from gehinna when the soul leaves this world. And what are these 3? One who engages in intercourse with a married woman, right? One who has an affair with a married woman, as this transgression is a serious offense against both God and a person. And in the notes, it also says about this that you can't atone for this unless, if you have an affair with a married woman, this is a terrible, terrible sin, punishable by death. If you were warned and went ahead with it despite the warning in the presence of witnesses, this is punishable by death in an earthly court. Usually you're not going to have that series of circumstances, so you'll be punished by the heavenly court. But you can make an atonement for this, right? And we're going to mention in very soon that King David cast his eyes on Bathsheba. And might well have been guilty of this sin or was guilty of this sin. There are some divergent opinions on this, but at any rate, he certainly coveted another man's wife and was called out on it by the prophet Nathan. And then David admitted that he was wrong, fasted, and made atonement for this. However, no matter what atonement you seek to make, if having this affair with a married woman produces a child from that union, so that child is a mamzer who's prohibited from marrying other Jews unless they're mamzers also. So the child ends up paying a price for this, abominable behavior of the parent committing adultery and producing a child out of that union. Right, and that's not something you can ever make up because that child enters life with this stain. This is one of the few instances where the actions of the parent, are visited on the child. The child, through no fault of its own, comes into the world with this stain. It's a terrible situation. Okay. So one who goes into Gehenna and doesn't emerge, it just says here, is one who has an affair with a married woman. What else? At that level, right? There's 3 that have this kind. So to tell you that this is one of the worst sins there is, right? To commit adultery with a married woman. Number 2, and one who humiliates another in public, right? So to humiliate someone in public is on the level of a cardinal sin, like committing adultery. And number 3, one who calls another a derogatory name. Now, just like calling someone names, how could you possibly say that that's on the level of, committing adultery? Like, it makes no sense, right? And the Gemara asks, with regard to one who calls another a derogatory name, that is identical to one who shames another person, humiliates another one publicly. Why are they listed separately? And the Gemara answers, although the victim grew accustomed to being called that name in place of his shame, and he is no longer humiliated by being called that name, since the intent was to insult him, the perpetrator's punishment is severe. And the Meiri explains that a reason why calling someone names or humiliating them publicly might be, it might be a little bit of this, sometimes it's hyperbole when they're saying these kinds of things, or maybe not. Like, how could you possibly say that name calling and public humiliation is on the level of committing adultery? And the answer is that somebody who does that will start to form the habit of doing it. Right? Usually the adulterer isn't running around being a serial adulterer. He might be, and that's going to be a heavy load of sin he's taking with him. But also the one who becomes a name caller and just issuing nicknames as he wishes and just, humiliating people that way. He thinks what he's doing is not so bad. And he will come to humiliate many people. And that may be an explanation of why that works that way. Let's keep going. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says it is preferable for a person to engage in intercourse with a woman whose married status is uncertain, and thereby you might be committing adultery, than to humiliate another person in public. Right? And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? And the Gemara answers, it is from that which Rav interpreted. We are on page 59a now. As Rav interpreted, what is the meaning of that which is written? Psalm 35:15. And when I limped, they rejoiced and gathered. They tore and did not cease. And the term damu can also be understood as a reference to blood. So concerning the fasting that he undertook, that King David undertook because of the sin with Bathsheba, David said before the Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that if my tormentors were to tear my flesh, my blood, dami, would not flow to the ground due to the excessive fasting that I have done to atone for my sin. And moreover, they torment me to the extent that even at the time when they are engaged in the public study of the laws of leprous sores, right, saras, and corpse tuma in a tent, right? That these are like complicated laws, i.e. halachic matters that have no connection to my sin, says King David. They say to me, David, one who engages in intercourse with a married woman, his death is effected with what form of execution? And I say to them, one who engages in intercourse with a married woman before witnesses and with forewarning, his death is by strangulation. But he still has a share in the world to come if he has made an atonement, for that sin. But, unless, right, with that exception of if it produced a mamzer. But if it didn't do that, okay, this is a terrible, terrible sin, but he can make an atonement. Or if he's actually executed for it by an earthly court, his death will make an atonement for him, right? Suffering that early death can actually atone for you. But one who humiliates another in public has no share in the world to come. The transgression of you who humiliate me, says King David, is more severe than my transgression because I can make an atonement. Now, again, that's if you don't atone for it, right? And usually the people who go around humiliating people, they don't atone for it because they don't realize they're doing it. They've become such habitual sinners with that sin that they don't notice it and they can't atone for it because they don't even realize that they're sinning. And that's why being one who humiliates others will lead, to a place in gehinna that's permanent and losing your share in the world to come. And Mar Zutra Bar Tuvia says that Rav says, and some say that Rav Chana Bar Business says, that Rabbi Shimon Chasida says, and some say Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, that it is more comfortable, in other words, it is preferable for a person to cast himself into a fiery furnace than to humiliate another in public in order to avoid being cast into the furnace, right? If your choice is cast yourself into a furnace or humiliate another, it'd be better for you. You'll be better off if you cast yourself in the furnace. And from where do we derive this? From Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah. When she was taken out to be burned, she did not reveal that she was pregnant with Judah's child, so she wouldn't humiliate him. Rather, she left the decision to him to avoid humiliating him in public, as it is written. And Judah said, bring her forth and let her be burnt. And when she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am pregnant by the man to whom these belong. And she said, examine these. Whose are these? The signet, the cords, and the staff. And Judah said, they are mine. She is more righteous than I. He admitted his sin, but she was more righteous than I because she didn't humiliate him in public and say, I'm pregnant by that man who slept with me thinking I was a harlot, etc. She didn't do that. New subject. Rav Hanana, the son of Rabbi Eliezer, says, what is the meaning of that which is written, and you shall not mistreat each man his colleague, amito, his colleague, from Leviticus 25:17. So the word amito is interpreted as a contraction of im ito, meaning one who is with him. So with one who is with you in observance of Torah and mitzvahs, you shall not mistreat him. Rav says a person must always be careful about any kind of mistreatment of his wife. In other words, never speak harshly to your wife, since her tears are easily elicited. Punishment for her mistreatment is immediate, right? So it's bad enough you humiliate someone. If you make them cry and they, and they cry out to heaven because they're being mistreated, then you who caused that, you're in big trouble. Rabbi Eliezer says, since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked, and prayer is not accepted as it once was, as it is stated in lament of the temple's destruction. Though I plead and call out, he shuts out my prayer. Lamentations 3:8. And this testifies to the way that the spiritual level of the Jewish people as a whole was diminished, right? Through the first temple period, culminating in the destruction of the first temple. Then the people made an atonement. They returned, led by Ezra, and they eventually rebuilt the second temple. They attained a certain level. And during the period of the second temple, their spiritual level fell, until the people did not merit to have the temple in their midst, right? And why was that? Because they turned away from God and they chased false idols and they behaved in all manner of ways, unbecoming a people chosen by God to fulfill the obligations of Torah and be a light unto the nations. The people did not behave that way, and so their prayers were not heard by God the way that they had been in earlier generations when, as a people, they were more committed to Torah and therefore closer to God. Nevertheless, even though prayers are always heard, but they weren't, they're not heard, we're just not as close as a people in this period that we're talking about here after the destruction of the second temple as they had been in earlier generations. And nevertheless, although those gates of prayer had become locked and prayers had to go around the gates, over the gates, it was very difficult to get the prayers through, the gate of tears remained open, right? And yet, despite the fact that the gates of prayer were locked with the destruction of the temple, the gates of tears were never locked. And the one who cries before God may rest assured that his prayers will be heard. As it is stated, hear my prayer, Lord, and give ear to my pleading. Keep not silence at my tears. Psalms 39:13. When we cry out to God from a place of deep passion, when we actually cry before God, not just cry out with our voices, but literally cry before God in our longing to our Father in heaven to be merciful with us, to grant our worthy wishes, our worthy prayers. Your prayers might not always be answered the way you want them answered, but prayers that come from tears ascending to heaven, it's like a hotline. It's like a hotline to God. And Rav says, nevertheless, anyone who follows the counsel of his wife descends into gehinna. As it is stated, but there was none like Ahab, right? King Ahab, who did not give himself over to do that which was evil. Who did give himself over to do that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, because his wife Jezebel incited him. We learned that 1 Kings 21:25. So Rav Papa said to Abaye, but don't people say a popular proverb? If your wife is short, stoop and whisper to her and consult with her. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult, as this statement of Rav instructs that one not follow his wife's counsel in general matters, and that proverb instructs that one follow her counsel in household matters. And the Gemara presents another version of this distinction. This statement of Rav maintains that one should not follow her counsel in divine matters, and that proverb maintains that one should follow her counsel in general matters. And we might say that a husband had better listen to his wife in any matter that affects their relationship, right? And he should be careful in listening to his wife, whether it's about spiritual matters or business matters or any matters, if his wife is counseling him to violate Torah. That we don't listen to, right? But if she's telling you what she needs so that you have a strong relationship, you better be listening. Rav Chisda says all the gates of heaven are apt to be locked except for the gates of prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment. As it is stated, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall built with a plumb line. A plumb line makes the wall, make sure, when you build it, that it's absolutely straight, vertically straight. That's what a plumb line does for you. And it says in Amos 7:7, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall built with a plumb line, and the plumb line was in his hand. So God stands with the scales of justice in his hand to determine if one has been subjected to injustice. So Rabbi Eliezer says, in response to all transgressions, God punishes the perpetrator by means of an agent, meaning like he'll send an angel or he'll arrange for circumstances to punish you. God doesn't intervene directly, personally, except for mistreatment, meaning verbal mistreatment, as it is stated, and a plumb line is in his hand. So the term for mistreatment and the term for plumb line are spelled in a similar manner, indicating that God himself exacts retribution. Rabbi Bahu says there are 3 sins before whose transgressors the curtain, hapargod, between this world and the divine presence is not locked. Their sins reach the divine presence, again, hotline. And they are verbal mistreatment, right? When you abuse another verbally, God hears that like immediately. God sees everything, hears everything. But this is going to, make a strong impression, right, in heaven. You don't want to be associated with that. Also, robbery and avodah zarah, idolatry. Now, we know that idolatry is a sin on the level of adultery and murder, right? So now you're being told that verbal mistreatment, humiliating another verbally, and robbery are on that level of idolatry. How do we know? Mistreatment, as it is stated, and a plumb line in his hand. Robbery, as it is stated, violence and robbery are heard in her. They are before me, God is speaking, continually. We learned that from Jeremiah. And idolatry, as it is stated, a people that angers me before me continually, that sacrifice in gardens and burn incense upon bricks, right? So Isaiah there is talking about the people who are acting like they're pious people, but really their hearts are turned elsewhere than God, whether it's idols or other kinds of pursuits. These people are hypocrites, and their hearts are turned toward idols, and that disgusts and angers God. Now, apropos the topic of how a man should approach his household, right, meaning his wife and children, so Rabbi Yehuda says a person must always be careful about ensuring that there is grain inside his house, as discord is found in a person's house only over matters of grain. As it is stated, he makes your borders peace, he gives you plenty with the finest wheat. So if there is the finest wheat in your house, there will be peace there, right? In short, make sure that the members of your household have what they need. And Rav Papa said this is in accordance with the adage that people say, when the barley is emptied from the jug, quarrel knocks and enters the house, right? When the money troubles start, what's that song, right? John Cougar Mellencamp. You guys know, right? They started to fight when the money got tight and they just didn't count on the tears, right? And Rav Chinana Bar Papa says a person must always be careful about ensuring that there is grain inside his house, as the Jewish people were characterized as poor only over matters of grain, as it is stated, and it was, if Israel sowed, and Midian and the children of the east ascended, Judges 6:3, and it is written, and they encamped against them, and they destroyed the crops of the land, and it is further written, and Israel was greatly impoverished due to Midian. In other words, when people don't have to eat, that's when they're truly poor. Lack of money, not necessarily. And Rabbi Chalbo says, a person must always be careful about sustaining the honor of his wife, as blessing is found in a person's house only because of his wife. As it is stated in allusion to this, and he dealt well with Abram for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen. And that is what Rava said to the residents of Mechoza, where he lived, honor your wives so that you will become rich, right? And we learn elsewhere, young men, when you're thinking about who you're going to marry, don't cast your eyes on the most beautiful or the one from the richest daddy. You look to the woman with character, right? The one with a character, with a sterling character, because she will bring blessing into the home that you are going to build together. Apropos, here we go. Apropos the topic of verbal mistreatment, we learned in a Mishna there in Tractate Kelim that if one cut an earthenware oven widthwise into segments and placed sand between each and every segment, Rabbi Eliezer deems it ritually pure. Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel, and therefore it is not susceptible to ritual purity. And the rabbis, the majority who disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer, deem it ritually impure, as it is functionally a complete oven. So, what is an oven in Talmudic times, right? You've seen them now. Sometimes they're called chimeneas, right? It's a clay oven that is a clay vessel, like a large clay vessel that, has a smoke hole in the top. But inside, there's space for a wood-burning fire and for whatever you're cooking alongside the fire. It's made out of clay. So clay vessels are susceptible to tumah, meaning that if a creeping thing like certain kinds of bugs or rodents were to go in there and die, it would become tameh. And the clay oven that has become tameh, you can't purify it. You can't, the fact that you're burning fire in it doesn't matter. The fact that you could immerse it in water wouldn't work. The only thing you can do with a clay oven is break it into pieces and get a new one. But that was, that's obviously high impact on poor people who can't, willy-nilly, if their oven becomes tameh, ritually impure, go get a new one. They have to smash it. It was a real problem. So comes a smart guy in that generation and invents a new kind of oven, which sort of looks like this, where instead of having one large clay vessel, he makes rings of clay that are stacked, and then functionally you get the same kind of oven shape, but because it's not made as one vessel, but rather these rings, which are separated with a layer of sand, right, some kind of layer of mortar sand between the rings, now you don't have a clay vessel. Right? You don't have a clay vessel. You have something that works like a clay oven, but it is not a clay vessel because it's made out of those concentric rings. So, Rabbi Eliezer says, very good. You understood the law correctly. This kind of oven will not become tameh if a dead creeping thing dies in there. You can just remove it and keep cooking in there. But the majority of the sages said, no, Rabbi Eliezer, you're wrong. And the reason they said wrong, and I saw this in a note, is because, people will misunderstand and they might come to think that, the sages changed the rules and now clay ovens don't become tameh. Or they might make this kind of oven of achnai, sort of looks like a coiled snake, and leave out the sand in between the layers, at which point, if all the layers are just of clay are touching each other, they're not being kept apart by that layer of sand in between, then everyone would agree that that kind of oven could become tameh. So to protect people from making that mistake, and there might have been other reasons as well, but at any rate, the majority said, you're wrong, Eliezer. That kind of oven is like all other clay ovens. It can become tameh, and it would need to be smashed if it does. And Rabbi Eliezer said, no, you guys are wrong. I know that you're the majority, and I'm the minority of one, but I'm right and you're wrong. So what happens? This is the epic battle. Now we're on page 59b. And this kind of oven is known as the oven of achnai. Achnai means snake. And the Gemara asks, what is the relevance of achnai, a snake in this context, other than the fact that it looks like one? Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said it is characterized in that manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like a snake, which often forms a coil when at rest. And with their statements, they deemed that kind of oven impure. And the sages taught on that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him. Now, it is worth noting that he wasn't just one of the sages. It was about him that his teacher had said, the previous greatest teacher of the generation said about Rabbi Eliezer, that if all the other sages were on one side of the scale and Rabbi Eliezer alone was on this side of the scale, his answer, his Torah knowledge, his wisdom would outweigh them all. He was the Gadol Deor. He was the greatest sage in his generation, and he was sure that the law was as he was describing it, and that the majority, although they were the majority, that they were wrong. So what happened? After failing to convince his fellow sages through logic, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. So the carob tree was uprooted from its place and, moved 100 cubits. 100 cubits. Like the tree got up and moved 50 yards. And some say 400 cubits. And the said to him, one does not cite proof of a Jewish law, of a halacha, from a carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, that stream over there will prove it. And the water in the stream began to flow backward. And they said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from a stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall, like the whole building was going to collapse on the sages assembled therein. That's how frustrated Eliezer was that they wouldn't listen to him, because he knew that he was right. And miracles are being performed, right? Obviously, God is interceding and performing miracles on Eliezer's behalf to help him prove that indeed the law is according to what he's saying. But the other sages say, we don't listen to miracles. So the walls began to fall in, and Rabbi Yehoshua rebuked the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halacha, what is the nature of your involvement, walls, in our dispute? And the Gemara relates, the walls did not cave in out of deference to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten back to where they've been out of deference to Rabbi Eliezer. And they still, right, to this day when the Gemara is being redacted, and they still remain leaning. And some would say spiritually that this was such a fissure, such a crack, such a epic battle, that in a sense the walls were damaged, and the walls of tradition, they stood. They didn't collapse, but they were dented on that day, and that dent, that leaning in has never gone away. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, let heaven prove it. And a divine voice, right? This is the translation of a bas kol, the daughter of a voice, right? But we mean a heavenly voice. Somehow, right, not God self speaking the way that God spoke at Mount Sinai, but nevertheless, some kind of lesser voice, but a voice that was unmistakably from heaven, spoke. Right? So says Rabbi Eliezer, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, let heaven prove it. And a divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you all differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses his opinion. You all know, right? That's what the Bas Kol is saying. Not only is he right, but you all know that he's the greatest among you. He has the greatest knowledge, the greatest, he retains everything he's ever learned, and his logic is impeccable. He is your leader. He's the greatest of the generation. Why are you all opposing him? Because he's always right, especially when he has this kind of confidence, now backed by miracles. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven, lo b'shamayim he, meaning the Torah was given to the Jews on earth. The Bible is on earth. It is not in heaven. It emanated from heaven. The Bible was written in heaven by God, right? The Torah was written by God. Moses took dictation, but he gave it to Moses on behalf of the Jewish people, and now it's here on earth, says Rabbi Yehoshua. It is not in heaven. That's Deuteronomy 30:12, where Moses, in his final sermon to the people, is saying that it is in your grasp to learn and teach Torah and do mitzvahs. It's not on some far-off land that people will say, who can go there? And it's not up in heaven that people will say, who can go up there? It's here on earth, right? So that's what they're quoting. And the Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven, in this context? And Rabbi Yirmiyah says that since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote, as God, you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. Meaning the Torah says at Exodus 23:2, you shall not follow the majority to pervert justice. You shall not follow the majority to do evil. Meaning, if what you're trying to do is good, you follow the majority. And from this phrase, from that verse, we derive that when the sages, who are considered the sages of the generation, get together and they work out what the law should be in some new situation that comes up, like a new technology, like the oven of achnai, they hash it out, they talk it through, they discuss, debate for as long as it takes, and then they vote. And you follow the majority. That's the law expressed in the Torah. So God gave the Jews a system for knowing what the law would be in novel situations. This is the oral tradition. This is why we have an oral tradition. And God said in the written Torah that the sages, basically we understand that you, the elders of the generation, the sages of the generation, will vote, like judges vote in the Sanhedrin, and this is the Sanhedrin that we're talking about. And Rabbi Eliezer, according to this, was wrong, no matter how confident he was that he was right. Even with support from heaven in the form of miracles, the fact is God had set up the system, and the system held that the sages vote. And Eliezer wouldn't accept the vote of the majority. He was undermining the democracy, not the general democracy of all the Jews, but the democracy of the sages who were competent to discuss these matters, and he wasn't accepting the majority rule. And so he was violating Torah in that regard. Since the majority of the rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the law is not ruled in accordance with him. And the Gemara relates, years after, Rabbi Nassan encountered Elijah, the prophet, and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration that the Torah is not in heaven, you gave it to us, we follow after the majority? And then what did God say up in heaven when this drama was going on down on earth? And Elijah said to him that the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me, my children have triumphed over me. In other words, the same way that a parent, right, will glow with joy if he's defeated or she's defeated, right, in a logical argument by a child who has taken education so seriously that they can come back at the parent and say, you taught me, I understood what you said, and that contradicts what you're doing now. And the parent has to say, you know what? You're right. And thank God I raised a child with such good values. So the sages said, on that day, right, now having overruled Rabbi Eliezer and having overruled him, even though he brought miracles to prove that what he was saying, the sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items that were deemed pure by that ruling of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven, and they burned them in the fire, right? Because they had to have one law emerge from the Sanhedrin, not Rabbi Eliezer's law and the law of the majority. You couldn't have that. And what Rav Moshe said, my son's teacher at the yeshiva at Araita in Jerusalem, what he said was the glory of this story and the glory of Rabbi Eliezer. And it's very sad what happens to him, as we're about to hear, because they overruled him and he wouldn't accept that they overruled him. They had to excommunicate him. But what Rabbi Eliezer did not do is set up some kind of competing Sanhedrin or create a new movement in Judaism. right, or create some new sect. He said, I know I'm right. I know you guys are wrong. You're going to excommunicate me, but I'm not going to set up, some other religion or some other brand of Judaism. I accept that you overruled me and that there's nothing I can do about it. And that is so important because the unity of the Jews above all. So they burned all the things in the fire that Rabbi Eliezer had deemed pure, and the sages reached a consensus in his regard, and they ostracized him, right? And in the notes it says that this wasn't the only matter where Rabbi Eliezer was contentious and difficult. He just generally was saying, look, I have a tradition, I learned it, and Rabbi Eliezer was a follower of Shammai, right? And the rest were all going after Hillel. And we learned elsewhere that the law is always according to Hillel. So Eliezer just had such a strong connection to the tradition that he couldn't let laws go. This wasn't the only example. And so at that point they said, listen, you taught us everything. But you're being too stubborn in a bunch of matters and you're making it impossible for us to run the system. And we're so sorry, but you're out. And that's what happened. They ostracized him. And the sages said, who will go and inform Rabbi Eliezer of his ostracism? So Rabbi Akiva, his beloved disciple, said to them, I will go, lest an unseemly person go and inform him in a callous and offensive manner, and he would thereby destroy the world. Now remember, we're learning this whole story in the context of the teaching that we had at the beginning, that somebody who is humiliated by others and brought to tears, that his prayer, when he cries to God in his tears, that prayer is heard in a manner unlike other prayers, right? So Rabbi Akiva foreshadows this right away, and he says, you've upset him so much, let somebody go and placate him. Okay, he can't be one of us, but we should show him that we respect him nonetheless. So what did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black, and he wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain, and he sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, which is the distance that one must maintain from an ostracized individual. And Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what is different about today from other days that you comport yourself in this manner? And Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. And he employed a euphemism as actually what they had done is distance Rabbi Eliezer from them. It wasn't that they were avoiding him. It was that they had excommunicated him. And Rabbi Eliezer understood, and he ripped his garments and removed his shoes like a mourner, as this is the custom of an ostracized person. And he dropped from his seat and he sat upon the ground, right? This he accepted. When he was championing laws that might help others, because he knew that the halacha was right, he would not bend. But when they excommunicated him, he's not going to say, you're wrong to excommunicate me. He accepted it. And the Gemara relates, his eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, and 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley. And some say that even dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled at that moment. And the sages taught there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned. And even Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at Yavne, the head of the sages who were responsible for the decision to ostracize Rabbi Eliezer, he was coming on a boat. Rabban Gamliel was coming on a boat at that time. And a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. And Rabban Gamliel said to the wave, it seems to me that this is only for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, as God punishes those who mistreat others. And Rabban Gamliel stood on his feet and said, Rabbeinu Shel Olam, Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that neither was it for my honor that I acted when we ostracized Rabbi Eliezer, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father, meaning the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. And he was a descendant of, he's the son of a Nasi and the father of a Nasi, etc. He wasn't doing it for his own honor, nor for the honor of the position and the family of the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. Rather, it was for your honor, Master of the universe, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel. And in response, the sea calmed from its raging. I'm almost done for today. Questions or comments, please get them in. The Gemara further relates, Ima Shalom, she's a woman, one of the great characters in the Talmud. We meet her in several places, and she was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer. I've heard elsewhere that she's the one who brought the oven of achnai to Rabbi Eliezer for the ruling and said, this is something that can really help the poor people. She's an incredibly compassionate woman. She was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, and she was the sister of Rabban Gamliel, the head of the Sanhedrin. And from that incident forward, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to lower his head and recite the Tachanan prayer when we cry out to God and we say we're so lowly, we've sinned in so many different ways. Please, God, find it in your power to forgive us. We say that every day unless it's a holiday, basically, or Shabbos. But she would not let him recite the daily Tachanan prayer because she knew that the gate of tears is always open. And Rabbi Eliezer, excommunicating him, is such a misery for him because he can no longer learn and teach Torah among the sages. It's like he's a person whose mission in this world cannot be fulfilled because they've excommunicated him. And so he was, heartbroken for the rest of his life. So she wouldn't let him say that Tachanan prayer. Why? The Tachanan prayer includes supplication and entreaties of Hashem. And she feared that were her husband Eliezer to bemoan his fate and to pray at that moment, her brother, the head of the Sanhedrin, Rabban Gamliel, would be punished. And there was a certain day, around the day of the new moon, right? Meaning when there was a new Hebrew month starting, and she inadvertently miscalculated the day of the month, and she thought it was still the old month. In other words, she thought it was Rosh Chodesh when we don't say Tachanan, when in fact it was not Rosh Chodesh, and it's a day when we do say Tachanan. So she forgot to interrupt her husband Eliezer as he was about to say Tachanan. And some say that a pauper came to her door and stood there, and she took out bread to him. And while she was busy with the pauper, she forgot to or neglected to interrupt her husband Eliezer from saying this Tachanan prayer. And when she returned, she found him saying that prayer. She saw that he had lowered his head in the Tachanan prayer, and she said to him, "You might as well arise. You already killed my brother." And meanwhile, the sound of a shofar emerged from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that the Nasi of the Sanhedrin had died. And Rabbi Eliezer said to her, "From where did you know that your brother would die?" And she said to him, "This is the tradition that I received from the house of the father of my father," right? Her father was the Nasi, his father was the Nasi, so it's a tradition within the house of the Nasi that all the gates of heaven may be blocked, but the gates of prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment are open. If you humiliate another person and that person cries out to heaven, why am I being bullied and mistreated and harassed like this? Woe unto you that caused that person to cry and be distressed in that manner. And there we'll stop for today. And we'll continue, God willing, tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through the epic battle of Rabbi Eliezer versus the sages in the oven of achnai story, a very, very famous, perhaps the most famous story in the Talmud, here on page 59b in Tractate Bava Metzia. Tom, can an observant Jew criticize a secular Jew for not being religious? We heard earlier that there's kind of a different level of obligations, among observant, to the observant. But listen, right now, every mitzvah that any Jew in the world does is going to make all the Jews in the world safer. We've never been so alienated from God as a people. We need every Jew to do a little more than they're doing, right? So that's why, like, you see Chabad out there just getting any Jew that moves. Have you put on tefillin? Did you ever put on tefillin? Can we put tefillin on you today? It's not that he has to become an observant Jew overnight, but any mitzvah that he does is good. Can I learn a little bit of Torah with you? A woman, have you ever lit Friday candles on Friday? Would you like to try it this week? You'll feel so special, right? So criticizing them for not being religious, that's probably not going to get them to be religious. Now, there are some people in the cure of space, right, trying to bring secular Jews closer to Torah, who said, what are you doing? You're sacrificing your eternal life by not fulfilling the commandments, and take a harsher line. I personally am always trying to get secular Jews to learn a little more, do a little more, and I come more, in line with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, more the carrot and the honey than the stick, right? Bill, if a formerly unobservant but currently pious Jew is behaving in a very high-handed and unmerciful way towards a currently unobservant Jew, can another pious Jew tactfully remind him that he ought to be as merciful to this person as others were to him when he was in that state? Definitely. Okay, so first of all, verbal mistreatment is not the same as rebuke, right? Rebuke, that's also something that we need to do. That's a different matter. How you do rebuke, right? If you do it wrong, it could be verbal mistreatment. So if you see somebody behaving in a way that is unbecoming of a Jew, especially of an observant Jew, and you'd like to, and you think that they're not going to be a scoffer, that they're going to be open to rebuke, and rare, right? Rare is the person, and rare is the generation that knows how to give rebuke, and rarer still the person in the generation that know how to accept rebuke. But definitely you do it privately. Of course you do it privately, not publicly. And you pull them aside. And look at how Rabbi Nassan, how the prophet Nassan, Prophet Nathan, rebuked King David. That's ballsy, right? Rebuking a king who could easily have you killed. And he says to him, when he said it, cast his eyes on Bathsheba and maybe took her from Uriah, and he doesn't say, what are you doing, king, stealing a man's wife? He says there was a rich man, who had thousands of sheep, and he had a guest come and visit him. And what did he do? So he could set out his sheep and a meal of sheep before his guest. Did he take one of his own sheep? No, he went to the poor man next door who only had one sheep and took that man's sheep, right? And then King David got the message, right? Nassan spoke in a way that David could hear and without humiliating him, because he had to do it somewhat publicly. He couldn't get a private audience with the king, but he spoke in a parable, and that was a gentle way to give rebuke. It looks like you guys were already talking about that. So our minds went to the same place. Beautiful. Wonderful. We all went to the same place, so let me keep going. Shandora. So the halacha is even prepared for debates with mutants. Professor X would have no leeway. I guess in terms of one who can make the walls cave in, right? Very good. And Bill, one of the things I think about a lot in this case is that Eliezer and the rabbis are, in a way, talking past each other. Eliezer is talking about what the law as written says, but the rabbis are making a call of policy. They're not saying that Rabbi Eliezer's arguments were lacking, but that their concerns about the impact of his ruling would be bad, far in excess of the ruling itself. God then steps in and offers Eliezer a compromise. He can save face. God said, I'm right. But the process, which God also created, will be upheld. But the law's practice is with the majority. So consider that the voice asks a question. Why are you opposing him? And the rabbis then have the option to respond. And I'd argue that Rabbi Yehoshua does. He cites the process, that the law is not in heaven, etc. Unfortunately, Eliezer couldn't accept the out. His pride takes over. And while God was willing to back him up to save face, but not so far as uprooting the whole tradition for the sake of one man, says Bill, on my bad days, I worry a little bit how easy it is to identify with Eliezer. Yeah, me too. Me too. What a beautiful explanation, Bill. And I would say that's definitely true. One of the problems I've always had with this story is, okay, the process, of course, we have to have that process. And we need that process every day that we're living, in the absence of the temple, in the absence of the Sanhedrin, with many poskening rabbis around the world, with constantly evolving technologies and new questions coming up all the time, and we have to have that process, right? We have to have that process. Why do we have that process? Why do we have a Torah? So a Jew can fulfill his obligations and come close to God, right? So a Jew can fulfill his obligations and come close to God. In this story, God speaks, right? And they say, well, you gave us a process. The process is going to overrule even your voice. I get it. I mean, the sages are also teaching us with this story how important it is to invest and to rely on that process. And for sure, how much we have to distrust somebody who comes along and says he's a prophet and he's speaking with God's voice or on behalf of God, and even if he performs signs and miracles, but if he comes, and this is a direct teaching that we have elsewhere, if even a prophet comes who proves that he's a prophet by predicting the future accurately, but then in his role as prophet says, I'm going to change the laws, I'm going to change the eternal laws of the Torah, then we don't listen to him. Then we don't listen to him. So certainly we have to learn all those lessons. But I would have thought that maybe an outcome of this story would have been something like, okay, Eliezer, it was very important for us to record everything that went on here, and that in the absence of a baskol, of a divine voice, the majority rules, period. No exceptions. Okay, but if God joins the conversation, we have to listen to him. How extraordinary that even when God joins the conversation, they said, you sent us the Torah in here, right? If we're wrong, you better let us know. Because as you said, Bill, the voice only asked a question. The voice didn't say, do it like Eliezer, or I'm going to drop this, study hall on your heads, or I'm going to drop this mountain on your heads, right? God didn't do that. Right? So God definitely, left it that way, let it be known that he would participate. But it's almost like, I'm wrong, right? The lesson is that we follow this process, even to the extent that unless God tells us, God's here and this is what you're going to do, and no process, unless that happens, we follow the process, right? And even when God joined with his voice, he didn't say, don't follow the process, right? So that is how sacred and how important. What is this process? It's the Talmud. That process is the oral law. That process is the oral tradition that began at Mount Sinai with God teaching certain laws orally to Moshe, who taught them to Joshua, who taught them to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the men of the great assembly, etc. That is the oral tradition that you and I are blessed to participate in today. Have a good night.